Okay, well, I'm glad to be here today. My name is Justin Meissen. I'm the program manager at the University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center. Um, uh, so, been there since 2016, and today I want to talk about Irvine Prairie, an Iowa prairie restoration project that's been ongoing since 2018. And specifically, I'll be sharing how we've been doing adaptive restoration, sourcing commercial seed, and doing monitoring to achieve our goal of restoring biodiversity there. Okay, so to start off, I'll just give a brief introduction to the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We're an organization based out of the University of Northern Iowa, and our mission is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. The center was born out of Iowa's native roadside vegetation program back in the 90s, and since then has grown in scope to multiple programs. So, again, the program I manage is the research program, where we focus on moving prairie restoration forward with applied science. Some of our other flagship programs are plant materials program, which is focused on getting more native seeds on the commercial market. And then we have the Iowa roadside management program, where we support managing native vegetation on roadsides around the state. And then finally, we have our newest program, Prairie on Farms, where the objective is to integrate prairie into ag landscapes. A bit more about my program. So our main focus is applied native revegetation research. So primarily, we're asking questions that have a direct impact to how we can get native vegetation on the ground more effectively and predictably. Um, that takes the form of field experiments where we can rigorously answer important questions, but we also deploy some demonstration sites that show, key ecological concepts in which we center field days around, especially in conjunction with our Prairie on Farms program. So, whether it takes the final form as policy recommendations or tools for practitioners, we're trying to generate tools and knowledge for grassland restoration in the upper Midwest. One thing that makes our research program unique, I think, is our ability to do field research that uses relevant tools that practitioners actually use. So we use industry standard native seed drills, other equipment. So our results are directly applicable to practitioners. Okay, so we talked about the mission of the TPC, Tallgrass Prairie Center, which is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. But what are we talking about when we say prairie restoration or ecosystem restoration? Well, the standard definition put forth by Society for Ecological Restoration is that ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So, the typical scenario in our part of the world here in Iowa is a piece of land that was once dominated by the highly biodiverse grassland ecosystem we call tallgrass prairie, was destroyed to produce crops. That's that first transition here. Then the process of assisting that crop field to recover that diverse assemblage of plants, animals, and ecosystem services that were lost. That's ecological restoration, the second transition, and the thing we'll focus on today. So, in other words, the question is, how do we get from here to there? What are the practical steps? What's the process to get the best outcomes? And that's what I hope I can share with you today. Okay, so let's first introduce the Irvine Prairie Project. Step one's going to be to get our bearings geographically. So we're talking about Irvine Prairie, tallgrass prairie restoration in eastern Iowa, northwestern Benton County near Dysart. So that's more or less in between Cedar Rapids and Waterloo here on the map. It's situated in the Iowan surface ecoregion. So it shares geography and geology with a lot of northwest or northeastern Iowa and to some degree southeastern Minnesota. So X marks the spot here. Okay, so we have to begin with Kathy Irvine and her husband David. So David and Kathy lived on a farm near Dysart. since 1970, though the farm had been in David's family for generations. On the farm, David operated the row crop production, and Kathy worked as a special education teacher in the Waterloo school system. David Kathy had a love of the land and a curiosity about the history of the area, and that cultivated an interest in Iowa's prairie roots. And then, after reading the book Where the Sky Began, they became particularly inspired by the diversity and vastness of Iowa's original prairie. So, when David passed away in 2016, Kathy started the process of restoring a portion of David's legacy farm to prairie so that Iowans and especially children would always be able to experience the wonderment of our native landscape. So that vision for the land that Kathy had was to restore an ecologically diverse tallgrass prairie that engages current and future generations of students and community members in learning about Iowa's prairie heritage. And here's the original farm taken from an aerial photo sometime in the 50s. Um, but how did the Tallgrass Prairie Center get involved? Well, partly it was due to a field day we hosted down the road from Kathy's place at a different farm where we were showing the value of using diverse prairie infield contour strips, so the Prairie Strip project. Here's Kathy in the audience who was thinking that maybe these people might be some good partners in getting her vision for her land to come to fruition. So here's our starting state. Um, Kathy donated a large portion of her land to UNI, and this is where we ended up starting. So the restoration area is outlined in red, and total area of the site is 292 acres. So you can see that farm that we looked at in the central area from that old aerial photo. This is kind of the landscape at Irvine Prairie, typical of eastern Iowa, where we have some of the best farm ground in the world. Essentially, all corn and beans to the horizon. Now, this is an aerial drone shot looking at the eastern border of Irvine Prairie, which is the bottom part of the photo, up to the red border. So, um, given this starting point, where do we want to finish at? Well, we want to prioritize restoring the biodiversity that we lost during the period of row crop agriculture here. So we can kind of look to the past to see what kind of ecosystem was there first, and we can look to the U.S. General Land Office surveys from the 1800s and see here where Irvine Prairie was outlined here, and then we can see the different land uses back in the 1830s. Dark green is forest, light green is savanna, and yellow tan is tallgrass prairie. So you can see that prior to its conversion to corn and soy, this landscape was overwhelmingly dominated by tallgrass prairie. And so that's our overarching goal, right? To reestablish tallgrass prairie that gets as close as possible to representing the biodiversity of the landscape that we lost. Primarily, we're doing that via plant introductions with seed. And the idea, so if we have high plant diversity, we'll also have high insect diversity and so on up the chain. So for Irvine Prairie, we've used peer review literature to set some formal goals that balance what we understand is feasible in ecological restoration with kind of what we aspire to achieve, which is ecosystem measures of similar prairie remnants. We won't go through all these, but taken together, if we achieve these, it would mean our vision for Irvine Prairie was being successfully carried out. But basically, we have goals for native plant composition, invasive species abundance, grassland bird abundance, and insect diversity. Okay, so now that we have our bearings about the project, let's talk about the way we've approached implementing it. Now, rather than doing the whole 292 acres at once, we opted to do smaller sections over time. So that gives us opportunities to do, little studies and experiments each year where we can try new methods. And importantly, we also have a lot of opportunities to measure success. Um, that lets us know if the new methods that we're trying are working, and are better than the quote unquote textbook methods that we started with. So then we get to use that knowledge to adopt those improved methods for the remainder of the project. Um, and that process is called adaptive restoration. So it uses the same principles from adaptive management, which you may have heard of already, just applied to ecosystem restoration. But how do you test things on just one site? Again, we split it up into smaller pieces. So each year is an opportunity to try a new technique, a new seed mix. It also means that fixing mistakes is easier, right? Reseeding 20 acres is a whole lot easier than reseeding 200. So, from this framework, I'll show you how we go about doing restoration here in an adaptive way. So once we split it all up, we had 11 units and 10 opportunities to adapt our methods. Okay, so we talked about these ideas of adaptive restoration, trying something new, measuring the results, and adopting the new method if it was better. So here's one of those in action. So we started out designing seed mixes for Irvine Prairie, kind of the classical way, right? Which is using 40 seeds per square foot and designing, specifically from there. But with some research based in part at Irvine Prairie, we discovered that we could make our seed mixes more effective by setting rates based on species seed size. So smaller seeds don't establish as well as larger seeds. So we are compensating for that. So our seed mixes look a bit different now. They have more small seeds and sometimes fewer larger seeds. And overall, the result is that maybe our seed budgets are a little more difficult to hit, but we are seeing more species that we put in the seed mix showing up, and we're getting more diverse plantings right off the bat. Okay, some other example. Um, uh, so we started to seed into soybean stubble, which is kind of the classic method. Certainly that works fine, but we were often concerned with having bare ground during the winter months when we're doing dormant seedings. That relatively bare ground is prime for seed loss from wind and water erosion. So we've been trying to come up with a new method, which is dormant seeding into an oat cover crop. So the oats get seeded right after beans come out by our farm operator, and that usually yields pretty good growth by the time seeding comes around in November. The oats freeze off in midwinter, but those roots still hold the soil. And by that time, seeds pretty well incorporated into the soil. Currently don't have enough data to make any evidence-based conclusions about this, but I'd say that anecdotally, we've had better results in the areas where we seeded into cover crop than bean stubble. Certainly helps keep the soil in place during a vulnerable time. Another example of how we've adapted and learned about doing seeding for ecological restoration. We started out the project using a seed drill in the spring, which is kind of the classic approach. We had good results, but there was a lot of time on the tractor, and we were often not seeing all the species that we wanted, especially some of the forbs. And so we looked at the literature to see what might be an improvement and found some good evidence for dormant season broadcasting. So we deployed that approach starting in 2021. And since then, we've found that to be a lot more time efficient, and it's producing more diverse plantings right off the bat. So while that's all really good, it does come with a bit of a slight hit to average establishment rates. All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about what we've learned about the seeding process. So, we design our mixes primarily to meet that species biodiversity goal. And And we use species lists, nearby reference prairie remnants, and range maps from the Biota of North America program to help us determine which species could plausibly have been at Irvine Prairie prior to cropping. And then once we have that set of species, we then tailor a mix based on what species moisture preferences are, kind of group them into wet, medium, and dry mixes. So at Irvine Prairie, we have pretty mesic soils throughout, so that ends up being wet mesic, and dry mesic mixes. Um, and on average, we've been including about 106 species in our seed mixes each year. So, how do we decide what goes where? We start with a soils map and we use it to sketch out our wet mesic areas in blue and dry mesic areas in orange and mesic areas in yellow. We don't have any true wetlands or anything, so we don't have any wet mixes per se. And here's what we came up with for our target plant communities. So this is the kind of vegetation we want to see on the landscape. And while this is the ideal based on the soils, it's not very actionable. Trying to apply seed evenly over such irregular shapes takes a lot of effort. And so it's not quite feasible with our current technology. So further, we simplify these mixes where they go, with the understanding that the underlying conditions are kind of going to sort out the edges, right? So this is the map of the actual seeding areas and the associated seed mixes that have gone there. So green is wet mesic, yellow mesic, and dry mesic. And you can see that while the seeding areas don't exactly match the soils, they do capture the general area. And each year we have sort of a seed mix that gets applied. And so you can see there's sort of replicates within each of these seeding years. So I can say, though, that this approach of making things simple grew out of my bad experience seeing that strange shape in the bottom middle. You can see down down here. That was not easy to do. And once we did that, we kind of changed our minds because achievability looks a lot different on the tractor than it does in the office. Okay, so our next step, once we design the mixes, is to acquire those seeds. So people typically get seeds either by purchasing them commercially, harvesting and cleaning by themselves, or through combination. So we rely primarily on commercial seed at Irvine Prairie. So we're purchasing probably 99% of the seed from commercial growers, using Source ID seed when we can. Our budget's about $400 to $600 an acre, which is higher than your typical CRP mix, but not super premium by any stretch. Part of the intent here is to show what's possible for regular landowners to achieve. Really biodiverse prairies are achievable with good seed mix design and commercially available seed. Remember, we're using over 100 species a year, and that's all commercially produced or purchased. Having said that, though, we do also have some very small scale wild collection for native plant populations that are nearby to ensure that those local genetics can persist on site. Okay, here I want to take a detour and talk more about our experience with purchasing native seed. So we wanted to design the most biodiverse seed mix as possible. So we wanted to see what kind of purchasing strategies actually help us get there while balancing costs. So when buying commercial seed, we can think of it in terms of some of the more important dimensions. So in terms of how much does the seed cost, how available are the species we want, and how ecologically suitable are the seed sources available. So we used 5 years of our seed quote data from 4 to 6 upper Midwest vendors of around 120 species per year to generate sort of what if scenarios that reflected the nature of the restoration project, given these hypothetical choices made in purchasing seed. So we looked at 3 strategies. The first is kind of a familiar approach, right? Just going with low bid. That so the only purchasing strategy here, again, minimize cost given a specified seed mix. Next, we looked at a strict suitability approach. So it was kind of a conservative approach where we're really serious about that local is best idea. Here we're being strict about the source of seeds and only accepting bids for seed no greater than 170 miles away. And we're also preferencing source identified or yellow tag seed. And then the last one, sort of a balanced approach where we ranked bids such that we preferenced closer sources, source ID seed, and lower costs, but we did not require local source seed. And we compared the seed sourcing strategies in terms of the trade off. So, in other words, we assess things in terms of how much worse was each strategy compared to the best one. So, we looked at species availability, cost, and ecological suitability as measured by source distance. Okay, so let's take a look at sourcing strategies and seed costs. So with these graphs, we're looking at trade-offs. So higher is bad. Um, Here we have percent greater than minimum cost. So things with a higher amount are more expensive. So we see here that the low cost approach, of course, that's going to be by definition the best. And if we compare the other strategies, the balanced approach is only 17% more expensive. Um, but the strict suitability approach was a lot more expensive, so 35% more than the low bid. So you really pay for that local's best strategy. Okay, let's look at ecological suitability. So source distance, again, lower is better. Certainly, the strict suitability strategy produces the best results, but the balanced approach is only 2.5% more distant than that strict strategy. Now, the low cost approach here had pretty big problems. On average, this produced seed mixes with sources that were more than 25% more distant than the others. But the bigger problem was that it produced more than four species each year with sources that were coming from more than 800 kilometers away. So that's like Wyoming, Montana, Washington. So much higher risk of maladaptation from that. All right, so finally, we're going to look at availability. Again, lower is better. Now, obviously, this is huge for restoration, restoring biodiversity goals here. So, first is interesting and encouraging that we're able to get 99% of the species we requested each year. So, that meant that, at least with this subset of data, 116 species were available each year on average. Um, So low cost and balanced approaches were pretty much the same from each other. But here's what was surprising to me. When you try to design for ecological suitability, you get a huge hit to availability. So local source priorities, you don't get that many species. So we only 72% of the species we requested were available using that strategy. So 72 species in the mixes compared to 115. So a big difference in the ability for us to achieve biodiversity goals. Okay, so to kind of sum that up, um, we found trade-offs between ecological suitability of seed sources, cost, and availability when using commercial seed for restoration. Just choosing the lowest price sources leads to risky maladaptation potential from extreme distances, while kind of the local is best approach leads to considerably less biodiverse restorations. Um, a balanced approach that's informed both by cost and preferencing and not requiring uh, local sources that helps get close to the optimal outcome related to biodiversity and cost. Okay, so we've been using the balanced approach that we described over the course of the project. So since 2028 through 2025, we've ended up with a restoration that's comprised of 96% of seeds in terms of pounds sown, less than 170 miles. And we've only had less than 1% of seed greater than 370 miles away. And two-thirds of the seed has been source identified. And overall, we've been able to use 162 species of seed. Again, this is all commercially produced and purchased. Okay. So now I want to talk through some of the ways that we do monitoring at Irvine Prairie, and we'll look at what kind of data they produce and how that helps us make decisions. So first, let's talk about a qualitative monitoring approach using photo points. So the idea here is to set up a series of points where we take the exact same photo over many years. So same time, same exact location, same exact camera direction. And doing this helps visualize changes, which often helps in communicating the importance of patience and ecological restoration. And you can even see a lot of, you can identify a lot of species even, and see some general trends over time using this. So let's take a look at one photo point that we established in 2020 and see kind of what that looks like. So each photo will be the same photo again over the course of six growing seasons in late June. So this is about 2 weeks in to that first planting. So not much going on, mostly cover crop and bare ground. This is the middle of the first growing season. We have lots of oats and mare's tail. The following year, we have lots of native species, but still quite a lot of mare's tail. Okay, so now just to show you kind of what you can see with these photo points, keep an eye on that white sage at the bottom right uh, quadrant of the photo, that white plant. Just to keep your eyes on that one. So next year's third growing season, we can see that there's a clone that's starting to grow and grow and grow and grow. So it's things like these that can help you visualize progress, or helps you identify new issues that arise. You can spot woody encroachment starting. Um, with this series of photos, we can identify quite a few plant species. I counted at least a dozen, and you can kind of roughly gauge the grass to forb ratio of the vegetation here. Okay. So, well, qualitative methods are very helpful. We really need quantitative methods to make evidence-based decisions. So, to do that, we adopted a slightly modified monitoring protocol developed by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative, designed specifically to monitor prairie reconstructions. And at this point, it's in pretty wide use. It's been adopted by several agencies. Of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service uses it, but also folks at the Minnesota DNR have been using it as well. So the protocol is split into two kinds of data collection. First one is called a meandering walk or a botanist's walk. This is basically where an observer walks through each seeding area, recording all the species they encounter, along with some basic abundance variables across the entire site. So you can see here on the zoomed in map, so this is the top right corner of Irvine Prairie. Here's a little locator map here. So again, um, one little corner of Irvine Prairie. But you can see here um, that the blue lines represent the path the observer walks through each seeding area. And here's a photo of a past research assistant helping out with this. Okay, and then that data yields this kind of graph, which is species richness over time for each seeding area. Again, just presence in each of those areas. So each little panel represents individual seeding area, species richness on the y-axis, and age of planting on the x-axis. Basically, we're able to see here whether we're finding more or less species over time. And we want to see this line go up and then stabilize. If we see it consistently decrease, we want to look into that planting further to see what's going on and see if there's something that needs to happen to change that. Okay, so that data aggregated from each seeding area then yields this graph, which is cumulative species richness across all of Irvine Prairie over time. So again, we want to see this line go up and then stabilize. So far so good. We continue to add species as we expect. We're increasing the area of the place. So yes, we should be seeing more species. Okay, and then the more intense monitoring that we do is a series of systematic vegetation surveys. So this is hands and knees plot work where we record all this plant species in a variety of quadrat frames. And in the first year, we count seedlings in that first frame. And that's where our methods diverge a little bit from the published um, frameworks that Fish and Wildlife Service have. Um, but we'll show you why I think that's quite helpful to restorations. Okay, so you can see here on the map how the plots are laid out. So these are in a grid across each seeding area. You can use a GIS system to put those, to develop that grid. And then we use GPS to locate each point. And with this, I've linked this our research maps to our to some maps on our website. So if you want to go and take a look at our research areas and how we lay it out, it's all on ArcGIS Online. So we have a couple of iframes on the website. You can check that out. And that's I put a link into the supplementary things for the talk. So take a look at that. Okay, so once we get these surveys done, this is the data that we use to make a lot of our decisions. So I'll show you how that works. Okay, so first we're going to look at initial establishment. So here each bar represents the amount of seedlings that we found in each seeding area at the end of its first growing season, with genet or plant density on the y-axis. So this is where we're using that seedling, first year seedling information. So we see a lot of variation, but importantly, we're almost always hitting our benchmark of 10 seedlings per square meter. It's about one plant per square foot, which tends to be pretty predictive of successful establishment in the future. So it's good to know that we're hitting our benchmarks, but more importantly, it's showing us this one planting here, for example, the 23WMB wet mesic area did not establish well, right? So this one right here. So that's going to give us a flag to zero in on that spot. Tells us that we need to keep a close eye on that planting and then consider reseeding if we're not seeing much improvement in establishment, which is what we did in some of those spots in that planting. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at plant diversity. So again, this is where we've linked to that specific set of goals we set earlier. We said based on other prairie restorations and prairie remnants that we wanted our plant diversity, as measured by effective species, to be at least 20. So here, each panel represents each seeding area over time, the age of planting on the x-axis and sown species diversity on the y-axis. And what we want to see is that more than half of our plantings have diversity above that blue line. And as of 2024, we have about 60% of our plantings achieving that goal. So we can feel good and with evidence backing us that Irvine Prairie is a successful restoration. Okay, so next I want to highlight some of the monitoring work that citizen scientists have done at Irvine Prairie. So our team at the Tallgrass Prairie Center is just a bunch of botanists. So really excited when some very talented folks started using Irvine Prairie as a study site. So first person I want to highlight today is John Feely and his work has been with the Bumblebee Atlas, spearheaded by the Xerxes Society. And so this is a huge, nearly nationwide effort to track bumblebee populations. And there's a lot of that work being done here with that in Iowa. So many times over the summer, John will come to Irvine Prairie. It's just as one of his many sites that he surveys. But when he's there, he's capturing bees, putting them on ice, identifying the plants they're using, and logging that data. And so here's John's data from this year, where he made 19 surveys. He got 153 captures of four different bumblebees, mostly common species, but some cool ones like the Arcomus, and good to see Pennsylvanicus there. Um, okay, so next I want to highlight some of the work another citizen scientist, MJ Hatfield, has done at Irvine Prairie. So um, MJ is a great entomologist who focuses a lot on larval host interactions. And she's found that so many of the insects that we tend, typically think of as remnant specific often will show up in restorations when the plant diversity is actually there. Um, so here's an example of some of the work she's done at Irvine Prairie. Um, so this picture of the sage that was taken at Irvine Prairie, and MJ found the larva and the moth of this case bear micro moth, which interestingly, that photo apparently made it into the paper naming the species. So that's kind of cool. Um, and you can see on the right, this is an example of all the work that MJ puts in rearing larvae on host plants and trying to figure out how what those interactions are for so many of our plants and insects. So she posts many of her observations here on Bug Guide, and I believe anybody can contribute to this as well. But it's a great place to submit insect observations. Kind of like iNaturalist, but I'd say it's just mostly entomologists on the site. And you can go on the website and search Irvine Prairie, and you'll get the list of a whole bunch of observations that MJ has made. Here are a few kind of the cool photos of the bugs that MJ has found out there. Um, all right, so let's just kind of recap what we covered today. Um, make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So the first thing is that adaptive restoration is a way to work towards best practices by doing, monitoring, and adjusting. Um, by staging projects over time, you can use this technique plus the smaller plantings mean smaller problems to solve if you have issues. A whole project failure is essentially not a risk if you're doing adaptive restoration. Next, we don't get it all when it comes to commercial seed sourcing, right? So we found that there's a trade-off between using only the most local source seed and the number of species that you can use in a seed mix. The good news is that we can pretty much solve this problem by using a purchasing strategy that prefers but does not require local source seed. And then finally, monitoring is the foundation for success. So if we don't have goals and we don't have measures of the ecosystem that we're producing, then we don't have evidence for success. It might feel or look like a success to some people, but that's a very different thing than having defensible metrics. There's a lot of different ways to do monitoring, from simple qualitative methods to statistically sound quantitative methods. But the most important thing is that you're doing some kind of monitoring in a systematic way. So hopefully I gave you a better idea of what it takes to go from this to that, and that you've learned a few ways that we try to improve the practice of ecological restoration. And a lot of people to thank, especially Kathy Irvin and Brian Piepert, our farm operator. Um, all the staff of the Tallgrass Prairie Center is involved with this project. Um, and we have had an amazing group of UNI students who have worked out here as well, and want to thank them. And thank our funders, of course, the Irvin Fund, but also we have several experiments out at Irvine Prairie that have been funded through the Farm Service Agency and Iowa Nutrient Research Center. So big shout out to everybody. Okay.